So today we're going to start talking about cellular respiration and how it's used to break down the sugar molecules that we ingest in order to convert it into energy in the form of ATP. And so all organisms are going to have some sort of mechanism to provide energy for themselves, because all organisms need energy. Without energy, your cells aren't going to work, so your tissues aren't going to work, so nothing else is going to work. So we have to have energy in order to survive. And so cellular respiration is going to be the process by which a lot of organisms produce this energy by breaking down of sugar molecules. And so before we get started, I kind of want to give you all like a big picture idea of what we're going to be talking about. And so at the very beginning, we'll go through a lot of kind of the introductory concepts, and then later on we'll go into each individual process and talk about them individually. But we're going to start off giving kind of big picture idea so you can kind of see what we're talking about. All right, so the equation for cellular respiration, we've got glucose, which is C6H12O6. We've got our molecule glucose. We've got some oxygen here. And so those are going to recombine in order to make carbon dioxide, water, and then energy. So we're going to go through and we're going to talk about where all these products come from and how everything's manipulated. And so what's happening here, the whole idea, we're breaking glucose. And in the process, we're creating a whole bunch of energy for the cell. And so what's going to happen, we're going to take electrons away from glucose, and we're going to give them to oxygen. Glucose is serving as a fuel right here, so this has a lot of potential energy stored within the molecule. And so by breaking it down, remember if you're breaking something down, this is a type of catabolism, right? So this is going to be an exergonic process. It's me releasing energy. But we're taking electrons away from glucose and we're giving them to oxygen. Once we give those electrons to oxygen, that's going to help us form water. And so since we are donating electrons to oxygen, all right, I think we talked about redox reactions already, but since oxygen is gaining electrons, we say that it's being reduced. So oxygen is being reduced to form water. Now, once you take those electrons away from glucose, all right, you're breaking it down, you're stripping it down, you're stripping the electrons away from it. That glucose is going to eventually become carbon dioxide. And so when you see carbon dioxide, that tells you that glucose has been completely broken down or completely oxidized. So we say that glucose is oxidized to form carbon dioxide. And so an oxidation is when you donate electrons to something. So in this case, glucose is donating electrons to carbon dioxide. So glucose is going to be broken down or oxidized to form carbon dioxide. And oxygen is going to be reduced to form water. And then along the way, the last step that we'll talk about, we're going to generate a whole bunch of ATP. And so all we're doing here is we're shuttling around electrons. All right, we're rearranging stuff, and we're going to end up making energy as a result of it. And so we're taking those electrons from that potential energy, that molecule of glucose. All right? So are we okay with this? Do I need to go over it one more time?
Yes.
Yes? Okay. All right. So cellular respiration, right? You're starting with sugar, and you're going to end up with energy and then some other byproducts. So the main point of cellular respiration is to break down sugar and to release energy for the cell to use. And so you're going to start off with glucose. So this is sugar, found in stuff we eat. It's a simple sugar, it's a monosaccharide. And so this glucose is going to be broken down. And by broken down, I mean we're taking electrons away from it, and then we're going to give those electrons to oxygen. And so these electrons, if you think about what a hydrogen ion is, how many protons and electrons in hydrogen? One, right? So you've got one proton and you've got one electron. So these electrons are being shuttled around in the form of a hydrogen atom, because a hydrogen atom has one electron. And so these electrons are being donated to oxygen, and they have their own little special taxi cab that carries them from glucose to oxygen. And so we'll discuss what that little taxi cab is too. And so you're taking electrons away from glucose and you're giving them to water. So if you give electrons to water, you're going to form water. I'm sorry, if you give electrons to oxygen, you're going to form water. And so these electrons come in the form of those hydrogens right there. So once we remove these electrons from glucose, we're breaking it down by removing these electrons. So once we remove these electrons, it's going to become carbon dioxide. So glucose is a bunch of carbons, a bunch of hydrogens, a bunch of oxygens. And so by the time you remove all those electrons away from them, you're going to be only left with a molecule of carbon dioxide. And so this carbon dioxide lets you know that glucose has been completely broken down, completely oxidized. And so we say that where oxygen is being reduced, you're adding electrons to it to make water, and then glucose is being oxidized, you're removing electrons from it in order to form carbon dioxide. And then in the last phase of cellular respiration, this is where we're going to generate all of our ATP. You good now? Okay. All right. So that being said, there is a cyclical relationship between cellular respiration and photosynthesis, and this is something that we brought up before. But so here you can see again the reaction for cellular respiration. You start with these organic sugar molecules and oxygen, and then afterwards you end up with carbon dioxide and water, and of course the most important thing, the generation of ATP. Now how it relates to photosynthesis, remember we said the equations are the exact opposite of one another. For every forward reaction there's going to be a reverse reaction as well. And so photosynthesis is actually going to be the reverse reaction from cellular respiration. And so photosynthesis will take the products of cellular respiration, ATP, carbon dioxide, and water, and it will rearrange them and use energy from the sun in order to build sugar molecules. And it's also going to produce oxygen as a byproduct. So the products of cellular respiration become the reactants for photosynthesis. And then the products of photosynthesis, right here, become the reactants for cellular respiration. And so there's this constant cycle between cellular respiration and photosynthesis. And autotrophs, remember what's an autotroph? What does that mean?
It creates its own food.
Right, it makes its own food, so that means it can build its own sugars. So autotrophs have the ability to do both of these processes hand in hand. So plants, they will use cellular respiration, and then those products from cellular respiration can immediately feed into photosynthesis in order to build these sugar molecules. And so, and keep in mind, remember we said way back in chapter 1 that when you're talking about the flow of energy, in this case, when energy comes in, it's coming in through the sunlight, and that's going to help power photosynthesis. Whereas when you're going to lose a little bit of heat, or a little bit of energy in the form is heat because of the second law of thermodynamics. It says for each one of these energy transformations that are occurring, you're going to lose a little bit of energy in the form of heat. And so because these reactions are opposite, one of them is going to be exergonic and one of them is going to be endergonic. So which one do you think is going to be endergonic, or required energy? Photosynthesis, right? Because we're building sugar molecules. And anytime you build, this is going to require energy. Think about building a house, right? You have to lay a house brick by brick. It takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of energy. Whereas now you have this house built and you spent all this energy, and it's not going to take a whole lot more energy to knock it all down. If you have one of those cranes with a big ball and you swing it in, it's going to fall down easier It's going to take less energy to bring it down than it is to build it up. And so since we're building sugars right here, this photosynthesis is going to be endergonic. And so that means that cellular respiration is going to be exergonic.
So the products of cellular respiration become the reactants that we need for photosynthesis?
Yes, and vice versa. And so then the products of photosynthesis, the sugar and the oxygen, can feed directly into cellular respiration. Okay, questions? Okay, so there's several different types of ways that organisms can make energy or make ATP for themselves. And so we use actually both types. So our primary way of gaining energy is through this cellular respiration. And another term for cellular respiration is going to be aerobic respiration. So aerobic means that oxygen is going to be present versus anaerobic respiration, which is where oxygen is not present. So the two main different kinds of ways to generate ATP are either with oxygen or without oxygen. So if you are a more complex organism like we are, then you're going to use either aerobic or anaerobic primarily. But organisms like bacteria and yeast that are more simple, they're going to use another process called fermentation. And so both fermentation and anaerobic respiration occur without the presence of oxygen. And depending on how complex of an organism you are, if you don't have oxygen, you're going to use one of these. But like we said, us humans, we're most of the time going to use this cellular respiration. But we also have a type of fermentation as a backup mechanism. So have you ever been to the gym and you exerted yourself, you're working your muscles, feeling the burn? Well, that burn is actually a byproduct of fermentation. And so we're going to focus mostly on cellular respiration today, but later on, maybe Monday or later today, we'll get into these other types of way to make ATP, including fermentation and cellular respiration. And so again, you can hear, or you can see the formula for glycolysis, which make sure you know this. All right, you've got a molecule of glucose, you've got 6 oxygens, and so this glucose molecule, this is serving as a fuel source. So a fuel is something that has a lot of potential energy that can be used for work. And so this glucose molecule, because it's got lots of carbons and lots of hydrogens, and so those hydrocarbon molecules are going to serve as a good source of fuel because they have all this potential energy contained in them. And so what's going to happen is we're breaking down or releasing all that potential energy that's stored in glucose. And so we're breaking it down, and the way we break it down is by stripping electrons away from it. And so the first couple of steps of cellular respiration are going to do just that. They're going to start breaking down glucose, and they're going to do it by removing electrons from glucose. And then later on in the process, once we've gathered all those electrons from glucose, we're going to turn around and give them to oxygen. When we give those electrons to oxygen, you're going to end up forming water. And once you've stripped away as many electrons as you can away from glucose, you're going to end up with a lonely old CO2 level, or 6 CO2s, I should say. And then in the last step, again, we're going to be releasing energy, both in the form of heat and also in the form of ATP. All right, so before we start getting into the nitty-gritty of cellular respiration, we need to make sure we understand what's happening with the shuttling of these electrons. And so both cellular respiration and photosynthesis are going to use what are called redox reactions. And so a redox reaction, it's a combination of what's called a reduction and an oxidation. And so we already kind of briefly mentioned this over here. In an oxidation, all right, you're removing electrons. a reduction, you're going to be adding electrons to something. So this is why we say that glucose, because we're removing electrons from it. In other words, glucose is donating its electrons to oxygen. So anytime you donate electrons, you're becoming oxidized. Whereas oxygen is going to be receiving those electrons from glucose. And so you're going to add these electrons on to oxygen. So we say that oxygen is being reduced to form water. And I know it's a little complicated seeing the reduced here, because you would think, oh, well, if you're losing electrons, wouldn't that be reduced? Well, that's not the case, because this reduced is actually referring to the amount of positive charge there. So if this oxygen molecule is gaining electrons, electrons are negatively charged, right? So if you're gaining electrons, you're adding electrons onto oxygen, you're reducing the amount of positive charge that molecule has. So it's a reduction in the amount of positive, and a gain in the amount of electrons, which are going to be negatively charged. So in a reduction, you're going to be adding electrons to something. In the case of cellular respiration, we're adding those electrons to oxygen. And then a oxidation is just the opposite. So when you have a molecule that's donating electrons to something else, that's going to be an oxidation. So I want you to make sure for cellular respiration, all the different steps that we're going to talk about, for each one you need to know the starting products and then the end products. And then also you need to be able to tell me what's being oxidized and what's being reduced. So in the main equation, we say that glucose is being oxidized to form carbon dioxide, and oxygen is being reduced in order to form water. And so because we are breaking down the sugar molecule, right, we're taking these electrons, we're oxidizing glucose, we're breaking it down, we're going from something that's complex to something that's simple, so this is going to release energy. So cellular respiration is always going to be an exergonic reaction. It's always going to release energy. And so one way you can tell if a reaction is energonic or exergonic, you see ATP in the products, that means at some point you're releasing energy. Whereas if we were to flip this around and make it the equation for photosynthesis, then ATP would be in the reactants, meaning that energy is needed, or not necessarily ATP, but energy from the sun is going to be needed for the process to move forward. But in this case, cellular respiration is always going to be an exergonic process, because we're breaking down glucose into smaller pieces until it's completely oxidized to form carbon dioxide. Are you still okay? Yes, good.
So you said if ATP is in the product, then it's exergonic.
Yeah, because that means you're releasing energy. Whereas the reactants, if ATP is a reactant, that means that you're going to have to use ATP.
So it'd be energonic.
Yeah, so that would be energonic. Okay. But this is going to be an exergonic reaction. Okay, so just to confuse you a little more. So we've already said that in an oxidation, you're donating electrons. All right, so this is just kind of a simple example. So we have this molecule X, and it's got some electrons. It's going to give those electrons to Y. So because it's giving electrons away, we say that X is being oxidized. So once you get rid of that extra electron, you have the oxidized version. Whereas the reduction, again, if you're gaining an electron, so if Y is accepting that electron from X, then we say that Y is being reduced, because you're adding electrons to it. Now, this Xe that's providing or donating this electron, this is going to be called the reducing agent. Even though it's an oxidation, we call this a reducing agent. And so the reason why is because this molecule is going to reduce Y by adding electrons to it, or by donating electrons to it. just like Y right here, this is going to be called the oxidizing agent. So Y is going to oxidize Xe by taking electrons away from it. So I know it's a little confusing, but primarily I want you to be able to know the difference between oxidation and reduction. So if something is being oxidized, it's being oxidized by a reducing agent. If something is being reduced, it's being reduced by an oxidizing agent. So it's kind of almost backwards from what you would expect it to be.
Glucose is the reducing agent.
Yeah, so in this case, exactly, glucose is going to be the reducing agent because it's the one donating the electrons. So glucose is going to reduce oxygen because but glucose itself is becoming oxidized. But it's acting as the reducing agent because it's the one giving its electrons away. And then oxygen would serve as kind of Y in this example. And this is going to be the oxidizing agent because it's going to be accepting those electrons from glucose. All right, is this kind of, are we okay with this? That's good, all right. Okay, so again, just to reiterate, so here we have our equation, taking these electrons away from glucose, we're oxidizing glucose, and so when we oxidize glucose, you're going to end up with some carbon dioxide, and all those electrons that we strip away from glucose, we're going to turn around and we're going to give them to oxygen. So by adding